Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, for a very special edition of Findmypast Fridays Live. You may have noticed from the different scenery that we're not in the London office. We're here in Bonnie, Dundee. You can see the silvery Tay behind me, the Tay Road Bridge, the old church steeple. We are right in the heart of our Dundee operation for a very poignant and special edition of Findmypast Live, because today is the 100th anniversary of the very first Remembrance Day for this week. The 11th of November 1919 was the very first time that people gathered to remember that on the 11th day, the 11th hour, the 11th month, we had a very first time to come together and honour those who lost their lives in the First World War, and now this day helps us remember all those who suffered and perished in conflict, particularly in the 20th century, but throughout history. And so that's why we wear our poppies with a little bit of poignancy. So we're going to be talking a lot about family history today. I'm Myko Clelland, if you don't know who I am, a resident genealogist and work in the licensing team and resident here in Dundee. It's wonderful to talk shop with you, talk about family history. It's a great opportunity, and you probably never shut me up, but we have half an hour to talk about as much as we can. I know some of you have been asking questions. It's very military themed. We're going to be talking about military ancestors and family history around that way. We have some questions and stories already, but don't stop. Do keep sending comments, questions. We have Alex Cox, who's usually hosting you, is actually on the other side of the camera this time in London, working to reply to your questions and shepherd things along. And we also have Ellie as well, who's here with me on the other side too, who will be helping, making sure nothing blows up or anything goes a little bit wrong. So we're going to have three different sections in this presentation. First of all, we're going to be reading out some of the stories you've submitted about your family history and how war has affected your own ancestors and what you've found in terms of looking for those military ancestors. Then we're going to be sharing some tips how you can get the best out of researching your own military ancestors and how you can find out more using Findmypast, and how to learn about the broader picture, how to tell more of a family history story, which is of course very important indeed. And then finally we'll be answering some questions, helping you to discover more. We'll try and get to as many as we can. I know we're on a tight schedule, but we'll try and get to everyone that we can, and of course we'll be answering live questions as well, so get those questions in as quickly as you can and as many as you can, and we'll try and pick some. They're being hand curated very wonderfully, and also the sun is setting, so we have to be out of here before sunset or things will get very difficult with the lighting. So as I said, today is 100th anniversary of the first Remembrance Day. The end of the First World War was at the time the most brutal conflict in human history. It's almost impossible to imagine the hardships that some of our ancestors would have faced, particularly those who fought on the front, not just the Western Front as well. There were those who fought in the Middle East, those who fought in Turkey and other places, all who really went through hell and back. And then of course those on the home front who suffered in their own way, those who worked in munitions factories, those who trained, those who did many other things. There were so many people who contributed to this, and all of them are worthy of having their story told so that they can live on for many other generations. So some of you were very kind enough to send in stories of how war shaped your family history. I'm going to use the trusty tablet here to read a few of them out and perhaps muse on them, and maybe we can share together. Helen Lightfoot lost three great-uncles in World War I. She had one prisoner of war in Germany who returned in 1919. Her great-uncle was captured by the Japanese. He returned in 1945 and was scarred for life. It's very important. I said not everyone died in the First World War, Second World War. Many were taken prisoner, and when they were, records were created, and they suffered quite a lot during this process. We have records of prisoners of war from the First, Second World War and other conflicts on Findmypast. Do take a look at them. They can tell you a lot, and when you find out where your person was a prisoner of war, take a look at other records from that collection, because we also have accounts of people who were in these camps. So your ancestor may not have given an account, but someone else may have, and you can then perhaps understand a bit more about what life was like in that particular area. We have Elisabeth Korstvedt Nielsen. As Norwegians, no one in my family was involved in the First World War, but in 1919, my great-grandfather's brother was a sailor on a ship that hit one of the many mines left behind from the war. The ship exploded and everyone on board was killed. He was married just a few weeks before he went to sea, and his widow never married again. His family had to read about the explosion in the newspaper. They had no idea. There's a lot of unexploded ordnance and things that carry on, even today, from the First World War. There is a special service in Belgium and France where farmers who uncover shells that haven't exploded can leave them by the side of the road, and they can be collected by the government to be disposed of safely. And this happens even this week. There probably have been a handful that have been found, and this continues. So much arms were used, so much ordnance, which means that there are still problems and still things that blight the landscape, and there are people that suffer now. My own aunt's father was killed at the end of the Second World War in exactly the same situation, through a sea mine that was just by their ship, and their fishing boat exploded and they died. And so it's a really sort of important thing that, although yes, people served in the military, there are many other people, many civilian casualties, some of them who had no part in the war, and so they are just as important to be remembered. And those newspaper reports are vital for finding out that little bit of extra detail, telling us more about their stories. Steve Catanack, my English grandfather was part of the British Army that liberated Belgium in 1944. He met my Flemish grandmother in Antwerp. They subsequently married and settled in the UK. My Anglo-Belgian family, still growing strong, was born. And on the same token, we have my father, a Cockney from Rosie Cannon, was seriously injured during training for the parachute regiment. He was taken off active duty and sent to guard prisoners in Norfolk. He met my mum there, who was in the Land Army. She was from Liverpool, so no war, no me or my siblings or our families. Something beautiful came from something terrible. So this kind of feeds into this really important point that there are many young men who enlisted in the Second World War and the First World War, but mostly in the Second World War, who were part of occupation armies and did work in these other countries. And when they were there, perhaps it's their first time away from their families and their homes, and they might fall in love with a local, and this might be the start of your family story. Using records on Findmypast, we have overseas marriages, the GRO records. They can be found through our record A to Z, and also in the main search. If you look at that, you can find these marriages if they're overseas. Perhaps they have military marriages as well, and then also we have the local marriages if perhaps they brought someone home. My own family was started with exactly the same sort of story, so I believe, if this hadn't have happened, this terrible thing, a beautiful thing also wouldn't have happened. So there's some happiness we can take from such terrible times. My grandfather met my grandmother in North Africa, and so in Tripoli, in Libya, that's where my family story really began for me. And so I'm very, very keen on pushing forward with these kinds of things and researching more about that, and be aware, of course, that those military districts are very, very large indeed, because they didn't have so many marriages. So North Africa, example, was signed off in Cyprus, if I remember rightly, and there were other different things as well. But lots of Austrians, Germans, Italians married soldiers of the occupation, and this could be where your British history begins, and you have a wonderful cosmopolitan history to look back on. We have Kenneth Webster. My father was sent to Africa in the 8th Army. After that, went through to Italy. A very changed man. Came home different. I only knew him after the war, and he was a very angry man. Lots of people came back from the First and Second World Wars and were changed by what they saw and what they experienced. Only really recently have we understood more about things like post-traumatic stress disorder, which we just called shell shock during the First World War. And these people suffered. They were injured, perhaps not visibly, but they definitely came home with injuries and scars. And so now we can understand a lot more using records that we can uncover that are no longer held under secrecy. We can then tell that story, and it's very, very important that we have that ability, because that again helps us to frame our family history understanding. Some of these people, from what they've seen, we can't even imagine, and there are many, many people who perhaps turn to alcohol or other things to numb what they've seen, and today would have a very different treatment. Back in that day, they would have to just get on with things, and it's a very different societal attitude nowadays. It's important to remember those people. All of these are really quite incredibly poignant stories, very, very important. There are so many that you sent in. We might get some more at the end. But they show how our personal histories in many different ways have been affected in some way by war and conflict, not just by those who served in the military, but again by civilians, people at home, many members of families. War has touched all of our family histories in some way or other, and it's really important that on this particular anniversary that we can look back and we can try and add some more of that detail to our own family story. So you might already know a few fragments of your military ancestors. You might be able to learn what you can from what you have, but maybe you've had some stories passed down to you, like someone that we've heard just before. Perhaps you might be lucky even enough to have a photograph, which can help you immeasurably. But if you'd like to know a little bit more, this is where websites like Findmypast can come in and help, and this is where I've been drafted in to give you a helping hand as well. The military records we hold on Findmypast are vast. How do you begin to make sense of it? There are military records, service records, pension records, records of injuries, records of medals, those people who were taken prisoner, as we mentioned. There are newspaper reports, there are bulletins, there are attestations. All of these things, perhaps if you don't know the first thing about these records, it can seem really daunting, but help is at hand. First of all, if you use our category search, so if you go to the search button that's on the top of your screen, click and then click on military, you'll be able to use just those records at once. That gives you a few extra fields, extra topics, extra things. Start with names, work from there. If you find a particular record set you're interested in, go to our record A to Z. You can find also on that little search box drop down, find that record set and read all that you can about that record set from the record description. That tells you everything you need to know about those records, anything that's missing, what certain codes might mean, and that can tell you a bit more about what you're looking at before you have to really investigate. Always look at the image, and importantly with military records, some of them are quite long. They have little silver arrows usually on the left and right when you're viewing them. Always click on those arrows. If you do, you'll go to the next page. Keep going until you either see someone else's name or the arrow disappears, and that means you've come to the end. If so, you might get far more detail about your ancestors. They can be anything up to 100 pages long, and I've seen some very, very detailed, comprehensive service records indeed. Start with what you know, relatives, stories, photographs, anything you have might help. Perhaps if you look at a photograph, you might be able to get some assistance, or just even Google the names of certain regiments, find the cap badges, find their insignia, and you might understand what regiment someone is from by looking just at the photograph. You can learn a lot from the little insignia that are on their sleeves, on their collars, everything else, even the type of uniform they're wearing, and that could guide your research a little more. Any bits of a story might help. Certain regiments enlisted from different areas and drew from these different populations. A little question for you, perhaps in the comments. Does anyone know, of course, the local regiment for Dundee? It's one that you're probably familiar with. The tartan is very famous. But if you can think of that, then that's a little bit of research for you while we're going through. No Googling, see if you know from your own knowledge. I'm sure I'll be letting know who finds it. Don't be afraid to research the wrong person. Perhaps you have a name of someone, let's pick James Clelland, and say there are 5 or 6 people with the same name in the First World War. Not all service records survive from the First World War. Probably around about 40% survive, thanks to an incendiary bomb in the Second World War. But there are other extant records that can really help to tell that story, give you more information. There are medal index cards, there are those attestations. We can still find information about our ancestors. And so what we might have to do is take every single person with that name who served in the war, look at their regiments, look at their service numbers, search through, and perhaps maybe for 3 of those 3 soldiers, 2 of them have a service record. When we look at those service records, we'll see next of kin, we'll see where they're from, and that means we'll be able to know straight away if that's the right person. If of those 3 people, 2 of them are not, then we can probably assume the 3rd one might be, and then we can start investigating even more this person. So be prepared to do a bit of research on someone else's family tree for a little while, just to see which one is yours, and that way you can be a little more sure. This negative confirmation is really, really useful and a powerful tool for all kinds of family history. It's one of my favourite ways of finding out who's who when I've got more common names. Hop from record to record again. That military search is a great thing because once we get a service number, enter that service number and take a look. People may be listed with slightly different names. There may be multiple people using the same service number through different times of history, different things. So you'll see a number of names, but that's okay because you'll know roughly which ones yours are. Things like MacDonald, as an idea, may have an A, may not, as one thing I've seen recently. But if you're using the service number, you should be able to link those records together very easily, and then you'll know the regiment and you'll know a lot more about that person. And dig for context as well. So there are many things, once you understand and know where your ancestor served and in what battalion, which regiment, you can go to places like the National Archives. Online they have a wonderful set of regimental diaries that will tell you exactly what your battalion was doing during the First World War. And you can find, perhaps if they lost their life, which conflict, which exact movement or battle that they suffered in and they lost their lives. It can tell you about their day-to-day movements. Usually only officers were mentioned if they died, others will be not included, but it's really important to see the whole picture and again to get that vital piece of context that we have. Be prepared to think laterally. A lot of records, as I've said, have been destroyed, but there are many that exist, and later records aren't public in some cases. You may have to apply to the Ministry of Defence for a service record after 1920, but if you're next of kin, that's okay. It takes a little bit of time, but it's really worth it. I've just had one for an uncle of mine, really interesting to see, and again it gives me that little bit of extra detail. And so maybe we could take photographs and military stories and start building a picture just from that. So there are lots of different ways we can get in. If you seem stuck, there are ways forwards. Hopefully those tips will go for you. There are probably some wonderful people helping out in the comments. I'm a little bit blind whilst I'm working through this in the baking sun of the Dundee heat. There are probably some very, very helpful people on the Findmypast forum and community that would also be very, very keen on helping you if you have any particular brick walls. So now perhaps we want to discover a bit more of the broader picture. We want to tell more of that story. A military record is just one part of that story, and then there are people who perhaps were left behind. Your family during wartime was immeasurably changed for a number of reasons. So what can we use to tell more of that story? We have, luckily, billions of records to do it. There are births, baptisms, marriages, burials, all the core records you're very, very used to. Marriage records, of course, we talked about those wartime marriages. There aren't just marriages for England and Wales. The civil marriages will cover soldiers from other places, soldiers who are overseas, and those people who married overseas and people from elsewhere. People even married at sea, people who perhaps served in the Navy or anything like that. Then, of course, there are no censuses for this period. There is no 1941 census. The 1931 census, everyone assumes, has destroyed in the Second World War because it was destroyed during that period. It wasn't as a result of enemy action. It was an errant spark caused an accidental fire. So there is no 1931 census either. The 1921 census, we're very pleased, is on its way to us. We'll be on Findmypast very soon. But the 1939 register is the closest thing to a census that we have, and that happened on the 29th of September 1939. So this is exactly when your family was in the midst of the beginning of World War II. So you can see what your family was doing on pretty much the dawn of the Second World War. It only registers the civilian population of England and Wales, so if your ancestor was already enlisted, they may not be here, they're probably training, but if they were away on leave, they may be. There is one particular part of this register that I'd like to draw your attention to, though. If you take a look at a 1939 register entry, then you'll see that we have scanned the entirety of the first page, but then also there's one column of the second page that we show you. That second page has that column which dictates anything that's considered militarily relevant. So you have people who are air raid wardens, people who are in the blood transfusion scheme, people who perhaps are in the reserves and haven't yet been called up. Sometimes you'll see people who served in the First World War with a service number, which can be really useful if you have a more common name and you want to get back a little bit further and you want to find those records we've just discussed. That can be really, really useful to you. There are newspapers as well, a huge asset and a great resource. They are full of photographs from about 1918 onwards, the golden age of newspaper photography. So many military ancestors had their photos taken, often before they left, in case they did die. They could be mentioned in the newspapers, and there are some wonderful stories in there and some very poignant, moving ones. Look for, if you know your ancestor didn't come back, look for details around the date they died and a little bit afterwards as well, and you might find casualty lists, etc. We have a huge collection of records from the First World War in the newspaper collection, and it's really, really big and vital. But also look for the regiments and the areas that you know your ancestors were serving in. You might find some photographs even then, and you may even be able to recognise them if you know which battalion, because they're also listed as well. 1918, all men over the age of 21 could vote, and so electoral registers are very, very useful, especially in 1918, as we have absent voters lists, and it will give you lists of those who served on the front. So we'll have their service number, we'll have where they're serving, so we'll have, say, Machine Gun Corps or Cameron Highlanders, and then we'll know that they're from that town, and that might be, again, that connection that we can use to prove that this medal index card is who we're looking for and get us to more records that can tell us about our ancestors. So now we have some questions that you've been sending in happily all the way through the week. I'm going to try my best to answer as many as we can in the time we have. We have, say, let's take a look. Avril, from 1799 to 1815, so quite a far back one. My great-great-great-great-grandfather William Lewis was in the 6th Battalion of the Royal Artillery. I know where the regiment was serving at various times, but how do I trace when and where his children were born? He was William Lewis, born 1775 in Llanbadarn, Garreg in Radnorshire. So, service records that we have on our site go all the way back to 1760. So you can find your military ancestors all the way through history, whether they served at Waterloo or the Napoleonic Wars or even earlier. So these service records will be a great place to start. They will give you an idea of troop movements. However, there are also these regimental records, and we have records from the Royal Artillery as well. This is a great place to look. There's another question as well about the Royal Artillery, which I'll feed into this one as well, which will help. Once you understand a little more about movements, you might be able to look at particular churches, but there are also military churches that were favoured by people who were on a certain barracks or anything like that. There's one I know called Restalrig in just outside of Edinburgh, which was used a lot by a particular regiment, and there are a lot of burials there of children of military soldiers and things like that. So have a look at where your ancestors may have been stationed and look at churches perhaps around there, and they might give you help for baptisms or different records. Depending on where they served, as I said, we see if he's serving during the Napoleonic Wars, we might have to take a look at home and see perhaps he's absent, perhaps there's something else, but also take a look at where he may have been if he was still in the country. He probably wouldn't have taken his wife and child or children with him abroad unless he was a senior officer, but it's worth learning a little more. So start with those service records, even this far back, and go from there. And don't forget, there are also things like the Garrison Artillery and many volunteer regiments who wouldn't have a service record in this collection, but still were often posted away from home because, of course, it's very difficult if they're fighting unrest or any kind of local rebellion to be ordered and instructed to fire on local people you may know very well. So they were traditionally moved to somewhere that they didn't recognise to assist if anything like that happened. And that also ties in with Karen Finn, whose grandfather served in the Royal Artillery in Malta during World War II, and they don't know where to go to get any information on this. The Royal Artillery Museum said they didn't have any World War II info they could give. A lot of documents were destroyed during the war. So yes, a lot of documents were destroyed, but when we go to these regimental museums, regimental libraries, all these things, they're often staffed by volunteers, and even when they're not, there are so many people asking for information and help. It's very difficult when you have just a little bit of information. If you can do some of the work for them and you can give them more information, it's much easier to find things. And that can be the little leg up that really helps. You can turn a task that might take 5 or 6 days into something that only takes an hour or something like that, and then people are much more able to find what you need. Yes, many records may be destroyed, but in terms of finding someone, if you have a service number, you have a place and things like that, a battalion, then it's much easier to get this information. So if you can find things on our website, we have attestations for the Royal Artillery. Take a look at those, see if you can find his number, see if you can find more of that, and then go back and give all of the information you can, every single bit of detail. Too much information is much better than too little. You're giving someone a name, and just a name, isn't going to be the greatest of help. But if you can give them the name, the battalion, the service number, where they were stationed, all the things that you know or you may know, that can really help them to move quickly and find things in this vast library of information that they have and the wonderful knowledge they have, which means they might be able to give you some extra help too. So that's very, very useful and very, very important. No matter where you're looking, this is a really big thing. We have a few more. Let's have a look. Any advice on finding military records for my great-grandfather Joseph Lever? I don't have a service number or regiment, but they know he lived in Bolton, and as I saw it, he was in World War I and went to Mesopotamia. I also understand he had his arm shot off during the war. He lived until 1960. So, first of all, start with his death record. It may see a little bit, perhaps a service number, perhaps detail if he's a retired soldier. He definitely would have applied for a pension because, of course, he was disabled thanks to efforts in the war, and so that's a big thing to look for. That's in our service record collection. If you can't find anything there, again, start working through the medal index cards, look for everyone with this name and try and then eliminate people from your search. And then when you have a few samples, different regiments, different service numbers, different battalions, find out where they went. Maybe only one of them went to Mesopotamia. That again could help to tell a bit more of that story and guide you to other records. I know we're getting closer to the end, so we're going to try and answer some live questions, this wonderful technology that we have. So let's see what we have here. So we have some live questions. We have questions, I can see them all now. What a wonderful technology that we have. So let's see what we have. Take a look. So Rosemary Morgan, I have the World War I medal and some letters from my great uncle via marriage who died in 1918, had his only daughter and had no offspring. Do you know who would be a good place to donate his medals to, as there's no close family? So first of all, regimental museums can have wonderful collections of medals. I always, and this has been something that I've been looking at relatively recently for my own family as well, they'd be the first place to look. Often, in some cases, they have quite a few and they may not have room or space, and they'll be quite honest and be able to tell you. And if so, there are local museums. There are places that will perhaps be able to put on a display and maybe tell more of this story. It's really important, I think, if we want this legacy to live on, that we can give it to somewhere that for a long time the stories can be shared and these can be used as a prompt to ask questions about the First, Second World War and about military conflict. So start with the regimental museum. If not, perhaps start with a local museum. There are a number of little sort of town history museums that often have World War I, World War II displays. And they could hopefully work with you and maybe tell a bit more of that story and really, really help to make sure that's not forgotten. That's a really important thing. Pauline Morton, what were the job exemptions for men being conscripted during World War I? Most of my ancestors were either farmers or worked in coal mines and don't seem to have any war records. I guess that means I'm lucky not to have lost anyone. So, Pauline, anything that was considered essential to the war effort was exempt. They had to develop a system of badges for people who were exempt because, of course, there was quite a lot of patriotism at the time, and people would hand white feathers to people they thought who were cowards and weren't fighting on the front without knowing they may be essentially needed back home. Miners, farmers, policemen, many, many people who didn't serve because of this. They were needed to keep society running. They didn't serve, but they served an important effort. Yes, it means you haven't lost anyone, that's very important, but there are different lists of exemptions that are online, and all of that is quite important to note. So they may not have served. Sometimes they will serve anyway. They have an exemption, but they can still volunteer and put their job aside. I know of a few farmhands, farmers, different people who have done exactly that. So do keep looking anyway, and do take a look. And there are many people we don't know even served. They may have been in the reserves, they may have been in volunteer regiments. That's also very important to look. But yes, even though your ancestors didn't perhaps serve abroad, they were still fighting in their own way for the war effort and making sure the home front continued. Everyone really pulled in during the war effort. There were many, many civilians and many, many different people who then had the war affect them in different ways. Before we go, we're offering free access to our records this weekend, with a few exceptions, but particularly our military records are all completely free, as well as some of the supporting records we've mentioned. So if you're like Teresa White, for example, another live question was slipping in, who doesn't have any information on service number, regiment, no photos, nothing, where do you begin? Start on the homepage, type a name, start searching. Everyone can do it this time. Really, really useful. Start with yourself, work backwards, keep building a family tree, and take a look at those military records for everyone that you can. If you build a family tree on Findmypast, our hints will suggest military records, but that's not all of the military records we have. So once you find something, go and look and search for yourself as well. It's really important to see all of those. It really helps you to delve in. Keep sharing your stories. Keep sharing those discoveries. We've got our Facebook, we've got Twitter, all these different places. Find My Past forum as well on our Facebook page. Everything you can think of. There's lots of like-minded individuals who are very, very keen to help with your brick walls and help talk about family history. Again, you can't keep me quiet. I'm always around as well. Everyone is always excited to share in that wonderful family history journey that we're all on. We're all very, very excited. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I know that those people who submitted questions and we haven't quite got to, we only have so many hours in the day, but those comments we'll take a look at, and maybe we'll slip some more replies in. I'll see what I can do as well. And again, get to that Findmypast forum, get to the page, get to Twitter, and talk more about this. And there'll be plenty of like-minded people who would love to step in and help as well. We're all a happy bunch here. We're our own little Findmypast family. So it's goodbye from me, from Ellie on the other side of the camera, from Alex over there in London, who I'm sure will be also helping out, sending some replies. I know he's very diligent and a very good genealogist. Have a lovely weekend, and please do take a moment to think about your own military ancestors this weekend, particularly on Sunday. Take a minute and just think, sit down and remember that everyone, perhaps whether they're at home or fighting, played a part in this terrible, terrible 20th century and beyond, and think about how this has changed your family story forever. It's really important whether you're wearing a poppy or not, or whether you're at a memorial or sat at home, to just think about that and just remember that our family story has been changed immeasurably, and just wonder what might have been. Thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.